Quote, "If fictionalizing the author is part of any reading experience, an exercise of the imagination which varies in degrees of importance depending on the book, it becomes a central issue in reading On the Heights of Despair, where the author deliberately invents a fictional self through rhetorical artifices and theatrical gestures in order to save his real self. Written in a moment of crisis, when he was helplessly and desperately insomniac, the book is a substitute for suicide and represents its cure. Its title makes a direct allusion to suicide notices placed in contemporary Romanian newspapers of the period, which invariably opened with the same formula. On the heights of despair, young so-and-so took his life. A rather pompous-sounding phrase, on the heights of despair, thus came to be recognized as a sort of generic rationale for all suicides. Using the cliché ironically, Cioran casts himself in the role of what I would call the young barbarian, or the beast of the apocalypse, who, with a blood and tear-stained face, uttering a savage cry of revolt and despair from the heart of his semi-oriental Balkans, hangs over the abyss of existential nausea. By casting himself in this character, Cioran commits suicide metaphorically, while managing to survive the call of death by releasing, through his invented character, the surplus of lyrical energy surrounding him." End quote. That is from Ilinka Zarifopol-Johnston's introduction to Emil Cioran's first book, On the Heights of Despair. And immediately after this passage, she quotes from one of Cioran's aphorisms in that work. Quote, "The terrifying experience and obsession of death, when preserved in consciousness, becomes ruinous. If you talk about death, you save part of yourself, but at the same time something of your real self dies because objectified meanings lose the actuality they have in consciousness." End quote. And we might also call to mind Nietzsche's aphorism here. Quote, "The thought of suicide is a great consolation. By means of it, one gets through many a dark night." End quote. Cioran's work, from Zarifopol-Johnston's perspective, is a demonstration of exactly how this is done, how one preserves oneself from death by writing about death, how one keeps from killing themselves by holding in their mind the thought of suicide, as Nietzsche says. You create a simulacrum of yourself and undertake the deed in the realm of poetry or philosophy rather than on one's physical person. The further example that Zarifopol-Johnston uses in the introduction is the work of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, The Sorrows of Young Werther. That's a novella that we have discussed on the show many times, although I've never done an episode about it, like a full-length episode about it, but I may in the future. The main character of that novel is a young man tortured by unrequited love, and he commits suicide at the climax of the story. The immense popularity of The Sorrows of Young Werther immediately catapulted the 24-year-old Goethe into literary stardom, but there was an unintended consequence of the novel's success. Young men in Europe began to dress like Werther, and there were a number of suicides linked to the novel, and they called this Werther fever, and the book was even banned in Italy and Denmark for that same reason. Goethe then inscribed the subsequent editions of the work with the words, quote, "Be a man and don't follow me," end quote. So we can imagine that Goethe, in the storm and stress of his youth, invented young Werther so that he could kill a fictionalized avatar of himself. In other words, precisely so that he could avoid suicide. And in fact, Goethe wrote that Werther was a demon that he managed to exorcise, quote, "so well that he did not suffer at all," end quote. It seems that Emil Cioran, even though he wrote that he had, quote, "no organ of feeling for Goethe," end quote, was to find himself in a similar position to that of the great German playwright. Cioran's work is an outpouring of sorrowful lyricism, as he describes it, a kind of poeticizing or romanticizing of inner turmoil, which are things that could also be said of Goethe's Sturm und Drang period. And for Cioran, who was at a similar age, also in his early 20s, a way of coping with a bout of severe insomnia and suicidal ideation. And similarly, Cioran's work has also been as Sorrows of Young Werther was, blamed for suicides, or at least blamed for bringing on a depression in its readers. Now, of course, I think we ought to be wiser than to blame someone's depression or their suicide on a book that they read, because if a book can quote-unquote push someone to commit suicide, then we'd have to conclude that such a person was already dangling over the edge, right, so to speak. It's hard to imagine a person with, say, a loving family and a purpose in life, a romantic partner, a steady diet, a healthy chemical balance in their brain, right, suddenly becomes depressed and suicidal because they encountered the thoughts of an old Romanian cynic. It does stand to wonder, though, why? Why would we have this thought tendency at all? Why would we have this tendency to suggest that philosophy could drive someone mad or make them take their own life? Perhaps the inexplicable nature of this act, as depressive thoughts and suicidal ideations are often hidden behind a mask, so to speak. So perhaps the inexplicability to one's family and friends, right, leads their confused and grieving loved ones to search for some culprit, some evil force, or some object that they can accuse of being the true cause. And it might be easier to accept that, your son or daughter was tricked by a devilish book than to accept that they were struggling with their mental health for years and you never noticed. But there's another possibility that perhaps we have a deep need to believe in the power of ideas, because the nature of modern society is idealism, for one, but also we cannot affirm the power of our own presumably good ideas, or presumably good life philosophy, without also affirming the power of philosophy to do evil. Whatever the reason for this error in thinking, for this attribution of so much power, the power to wreck someone's whole life and worldview invested into a book, whatever the reason for us thinking that, Cioran himself implicitly rejects and repudiates this view and follows in the footsteps of Nietzsche insofar as he sees thought as a reification of instinct. In other words, there is an underlying physiological reality to someone's psychology. Someone's depression, just as much as their happiness, can be traced to their instincts. Cioran writes, quote, "The only fear is, in fact, the fear of death. Different kinds of fears are merely a manifestation of the same fundamental psychological reality in its various aspects. Those who try to eliminate the fear of death through artificial reasoning are totally mistaken, because it is impossible to cancel an organic fear by way of abstract constructs." End quote. Well, to argue by analogy, if it is impossible to cancel the fear of death by means of the abstract, presumably it's also impossible to bring on a desire for death by the same means. Emotional realities are rooted in the organic. That would mean they find their author in a drive. And Nietzsche is the forerunner of this attitude, because he argued how it's always some drive which is actually doing philosophy, for example, which is doing the thinking. It's not the philosopher in the sense of a disconnected intellect. And it's not as if there's been no philosopher who's ever come along who has written philosophy that is completely abstract and detached. But as Nietzsche argued, that only indicates that the real goal of its author lies elsewhere. So Cioran would hold, like Nietzsche, that the value of philosophy, the value of thought, is exactly found, or it's found in precisely those thoughts that bear most obviously the stamp of origin of having come from the drives of that thought's owner. As Nietzsche would have put it, that sort of bear witness to the moral or immoral germ out of which their entire project sprung. Why would that be? Why would that be the true value of thought and philosophy? Well, because it reveals something to ourselves, about ourselves, far from revealing something about the world at large, separate from ourselves. So Cioran writes, quote, "I like the thought which preserves a whiff of flesh and blood, and I prefer 1,000 times an idea rising from sexual tension or nervous depression to an empty abstraction." End quote. And so that would be my case for the artistic merit of On the Heights of Despair, or of Cioran's work in general, in spite of whatever we might think, whatever conclusion we might come to as to the value of depressive philosophy in general, speaking from the standpoint of utility. Very hard to argue that there is any value there. But artistically, Cioran's supremely depressive philosophy offers us something of that whiff of flesh and blood. It's a record of a man's inner states when he was in a kind of emotional turmoil, intellectual agony even. As Zarifopol-Johnston points out, the sections of the book are uneven in every way, and the disorganization, the refusal of any structure or any overall philosophical point to the work, it borders on the grotesque. Cioran himself, in retrospect, had plenty of criticism for his first book. He said in 1994, a year before his death, that, quote, "It is a very poorly written book without any style," end quote. This is hardly even a work of philosophy, in fact. It's just as much could be considered a prose poem, which simply expresses a series of moods, which are often incongruous, sometimes jarringly so. The sections are of varying lengths, varying degrees of seriousness and sarcasm, to the point that any systematic attempt at analyzing Cioran's On the Heights of Despair is bound to fail. And that would have been much to its author's pleasure. He writes, quote, "Haven't people learned yet that the time of superficial intellectual games is over, that agony is infinitely more important than syllogism, that a cry of despair is more revealing than the most subtle thought, and that tears always have deeper roots than smiles," end quote. And so we are faced with a work that has been called anti-pedagogical. This book does not convey any new information. It doesn't teach anything. It doesn't solve any philosophical problems. It doesn't even give us any new philosophical problems. It doesn't even give us a new language game. It doesn't innovate upon any past framing. Again, it's hardly even philosophy. Any attempt to classify Cioran would have to place him among the nihilists, or at best, the absurdists and the ironists. And really, is there much of a difference between these labels? Cioran has nothing to offer us, at least he has nothing serious. And lest anyone think that from, this description I've given, that this is a work of profound seriousness. One will find that, in fact, Cioran is a very funny author at times. He has moments of good humor. He has moments of wit and playfulness, even within this brutally pessimistic work. Even his sadness is not, it can't be understood systematically as a kind of emotional regime ruling over the work. In fact, nothing rules over this work other than the momentary tyranny of a feeling, which is always expressed in its complete fullness without any regard for logical validation or the attempt to construct something that we would recognize as philosophical out of that feeling. It's as though Cioran is doing philosophy in accord with the diagnosis of Nietzsche, especially in the first chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, that, where he makes these criticisms that the likes of Kant and Spinoza and Epicurus and Descartes and Plato, all the great philosophers, created their systems of thought, their methodologies, their supposedly ironclad arguments as that kind of elaboration upon a drive, or as a kind of compensation for an unfulfilled drive. Only Cioran doesn't take that next step. He doesn't philosophically elaborate. He never gets to the point of founding a system, or even articulating an original idea. It's like he stays in the pure realm of artistry and mysticism, poetical ravings given forth by a muse. He never decides with that retrospective glance, that moralist's urge to quote-unquote do something or build something. He never tries to and transform those feelings into the abstract, we'll say. And so paradoxically, Cioran, again, is not doing philosophy at all. And yet, in a sense, he's doing pure philosophy. Philosophy unadorned by the pretenses of logic. Philosophy as a mystical experience of speaking forth the mysteries of the body, the unknown text upon which our conscious life is only a commentary. Purely that and nothing else. And so that's my case for my audience, who are all presumably life-affirming Nietzscheans, for delving into Emil Cioran's On the Heights of Despair, which is perhaps one of the most depressing books that you could ever read. And in fact, the book should not be taken as an endorsement of a depressive worldview, and much less so of suicide. Rather, it is a riposte against these things, because depressive thoughts can never be countered with arguments or with saccharine optimism. Cioran writes in the passage entitled On Not Wanting to Live, quote, "If you go on living, you do so only through your capacity for objectification, your ability to free yourself, in writing, from infinite strain. Creativity is a temporary salvation from the claws of death." End quote. Paradoxically, we may have to entertain such feelings in order to conquer them. We may have to go into the abyss completely in order to free ourselves of abysmal thoughts. And you can see this work as part of that age-old process, encapsulated in the dark night of the soul, spoken of by the alchemists, as well as modern practitioners of meditation and so on. Or we might think of Carl Jung's aphorism that no tree can grow to heaven without roots that reach down to hell. So, again, we should just see this book as the pure distillation of feeling. And if you are so strong and secure in your own feeling for the value of life, then we ought to know that a book can't knock you off of that center. Or could it, right? How strong are you really? The only way to find out is to go on the journey yourself. Before we do that in this episode, we'll go over the basic details of Cioran's life so that we can situate that book in that context. He was born in Resenar, a village in Transylvania, and it was home to a few thousand people. It still is. Today, it's part of Romania, but at the time of Cioran's birth, his hometown was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, although virtually all of the inhabitants were Romanian. Obviously, Austria-Hungary was a multinational empire. His father was a priest, and his mother was the leader of the Christian Women's League, so he came from a family with a strong religious conviction. Cioran apparently had a considerable degree of disdain for what he called the timeless peasants of his rural upbringing. He felt no connection to the people of his homeland, much less the sort of rural Christians around him. And, apparently just had no romanticism for the idyllic rural life. At the age of 17, he attended the University of Bucharest, where he met the playwright Eugene Ionesco, whose ideas were formative upon Cioran in his youth. By the age of 20, he began to suffer from insomnia. And this condition is probably more than anything responsible for the content of On the Heights of Despair. Suffice to say, more than a decade of sleepless nights made its indelible mark on Cioran's mind. And even though we're not on to the book quite yet, it was written in the throes of this insomnia. So I'm going to read an excerpt from his writing on insomnia that appears in On the Heights of Despair, just so we have some indication of what prolonged insomnia did to Cioran's mental state. Quote, "Whoever said that sleep is the equivalent of hope had a penetrating intuition of the frightening importance not only of sleep, but also of insomnia. The importance of insomnia is so colossal that I am tempted to define man as the animal who cannot sleep. Why call him a rational animal when other animals are equally reasonable? But there is not another animal in the entire creation that wants to sleep yet cannot. Sleep is forgetfulness. Life's drama, its complications and obsessions vanish completely, and every awakening is a new beginning, a new hope. Life thus maintains a pleasant discontinuity, the illusion of permanent regeneration. Insomnia, on the other hand, gives birth to a feeling of irrevocable sadness, despair, and agony. The healthy man, the animal, only dabbles in insomnia. He knows nothing of those who would give a kingdom for an hour of unconscious sleep, those as terrified by the sight of a bed as they would be of a torture rack. There is a close link between insomnia and despair. The loss of hope comes with the loss of sleep. The difference between paradise and hell: you can always sleep in paradise, never in hell. God punished man by taking away sleep and giving him knowledge." End quote. Wonderful example of Cioranic prose, and by the way, this is why I have a problem with the older Cioran's self-deprecating remarks that On the Heights of Despair is badly written and has no style, because there's no contrived style, but we can see in each sentence a sort of logic, not of thought, but of feeling. Each sentiment, each sentence almost stands on its own as a complete thought, and yet we can see how through the sort of like free associations of consciousness, his musings sort of take him all over the place, through the cosmos, up to God in heaven, down to the punishments of the damned in hell. And of course, any critic could immediately latch onto the obvious fact that an insomniac, calling mankind the animal who cannot sleep, that's simply a reflection or a projection of his own life, his own problems. But that is precisely the point, right? That's precisely the value of Cioran's work. There's no pretense to proving that notion as though it were a syllogism. It is just nakedly the expression of his own experience. In any case, his insomnia began at that young age, and it haunted him throughout his 20s. That's already a very difficult period of life, a period where many people go through difficulties like anxiety and depression, and Cioran certainly had that experience in spades. In 1933, at the age of 22, Cioran attended the University of Berlin. That's a very notable year to be in Germany, and the young Cioran did flirt with the fascist ideology, although he would later say that his involvement with fascism was something he deeply regretted, that it was the worst folly of his youth. But I would also say, given that Cioran is a nihilist, even at this point in his life, it's difficult to treat his politics at this time very seriously. It has virtually no impact on the work. And of far greater importance during this time to understanding his philosophical work, we would have to look to the pantheon of German thinkers that he studied while at the university: Kant, Schopenhauer, Fichte, in addition to people like Balzac and Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard, and of course Nietzsche. It was a year later that he published On the Heights of Despair, which is one of only a handful of books that Cioran authored in Romanian. After 1936, he returned home and attempted to teach in Romania, but he had an unpleasant time. After all, he never really liked his fellow Romanians. In 1937, he left Romania for Paris, and thereafter would write his works in French. He'd also tried to go and take up residency in Spain, but then the Spanish Civil War broke out. Obviously he was in Paris when it was occupied. It was just a chaotic time in Europe in general. 1937 is the end, therefore, of Cioran's Romanian period and the beginning of his French period. He would return to Romania for a brief time in the 40s, but other than that, he never lived in Romania again. He met his life partner in Paris, Simone Bout, with whom he lived until his death, although he kept their relationship intensely private and almost nothing is known about it. All we do know is that she was also an insomniac. Perhaps, as the adage goes, misery loves company. His relationship was not the only thing that Cioran was private about. One could say that his entire life in Paris, ironically, was far more secluded and hermit-like than it ever was when he lived in a village of a few thousand. Though he lived in the vibrant Latin Quarter, most of the latter half of his life was spent withdrawn from the rest of the world. When Elinka Zarifopol-Johnston, his English translator, came to visit him at his modest apartment, Cioran was an old man, and she asked him what he was writing. He answered that he was writing nothing, that he had given up writing. She quotes him as saying, quote, "I don't want to slander the universe anymore. I've done it long enough, don't you think?" End quote. Emil Cioran passed away of Alzheimer's disease in 1995 at the age of 84. He is interred in a tomb next to his life partner, Simone, at Montparnasse Cemetery. Cioran wrote a number of books in French that have achieved some notoriety, such as A Short History of Decay, The Trouble with Being Born, Drawn and Quartered, The Fall into Time. But his most famous work, for better or for worse, has always been his first, On the Heights of Despair. Perhaps because of its raw, brutally pessimistic and very evocative and provocative nature. Not that Cioran's other works are necessarily lacking in this regard, but there's a lack of polish in his first work. There's a lack of stylistic development, honestly, that I think actually works in favor of On the Heights of Despair. And, depressive philosophy is, after all, a young man's game. And if the real currency of depressive philosophy is feeling rather than thought, then youth will always have the advantage. So while the older Cioran tackled many of the same topics with a considerably better developed style and a greater degree of maturity to his thought, these same topics of madness and death and anxiety and depression and, yes, insomnia, the perennial appeal of this first work is precisely in its immaturity, the lack of wisdom, which might, normally allow, it might grant you some perspective, some distance on your feelings. But here, all of the interstates are just incredibly uncomfortably close, right? There's no distance at all. It's all heightened to the pitch of paroxysm. So now, as I've already said, there's no logical way to approach this work, to talk about it, to analyze it. But the first section is as good a place to begin as any because it is entitled On Being Lyrical. And that, as I've suggested, is sort of if there is any sort of underlying operating logic to this book, it's that it's a lyrical book, a prose poem, rather than really a work of philosophy. So the section begins with the sentence, quote, "Why can't we stay closed up inside ourselves?" End quote. And in effect, that's the question posed to the work itself. Why, after all, do I, Emil Cioran, have the compulsion to write this book? Why do I feel the need to commit these feelings inside myself to this externalized form? Why put these inner states into the form of these semi-poetical, lyrical musings? And it's actually not an easy question to answer from a logical standpoint. And of course, Cioran does not tackle it that way. Quote, "Why do we chase after expression and form, trying to deliver ourselves of our precious contents or meanings, desperately attempting to organize what is, after all, a rebellious and chaotic process? Wouldn't it be more creative simply to surrender our inner fluidity without any intention of objectifying it, intimately and voluptuously soaking in our own inner turmoil and struggle?" End quote. And after musing on how beautiful that would be if we could simply vibrate in this heightened tension and struggle, be so full of feeling that we could die of life itself, as he says, Cioran finally answers this question. Quote, "Only a few can endure such experiences to the end. There is always a serious danger in repressing something which requires objectification and locking up explosive energy, because there comes a moment when one cannot restrain such overwhelming power." End quote. Further down, he continues, quote, "To be lyrical means you cannot stay closed up inside yourself. The need to externalize is the more intense, the more the lyricism is interiorized, profound, and concentrated. Why is the suffering or the loving man lyrical? Because such states, although different in nature and orientation, spring out from the deepest and most intimate part of our being, from the substantial center of subjectivity, as from a radiation zone. What is unique and specific in us is then realized in a form so expressive that the individual rises onto a universal plane. The deepest subjective experiences are also the most universal, because through them one reaches the original source of life." End quote. And then one more section in the same chapter, quote, "The fact that almost everybody writes poetry when in love proves that the resources of conceptual thinking are too poor to express their inner infinity. Inner lyricism finds adequate objectification only through fluid, irrational material. The experience of suffering is a similar case." End quote. It's difficult to stop here and become serious about the philosophical content of what Cioran offers, because it's very difficult to argue that he himself is being serious about it. But what we have is, in some sense, the simpler observation that, for one, all of us experience feelings so powerful that they demand objectification. And furthermore, that thought is inadequate to the task of objectifying feeling. So men become lyrical when they suffer, or when they have a life-threatening illness, or when they meet the love of their life, or when they lose the love of their life, or when they face their own mortality, right? It ought to raise our skepticism toward the value of philosophy, or indeed toward the value of rational thought itself, given that when we would seem to need it the most, we find it totally inadequate. I mean, remember Cicero's coinage that to philosophize is to learn to die, for which Montaigne entitled one of his essays. Well, what does it say about the power of philosophy to teach us to die when, as Nietzsche says, when men actually face the abyss of death, usually their capacity for rational and articulate expression fails them? An interesting line in this section is when Cioran says that madness can be seen as the paroxysm of lyricism. And a paroxysm is a sort of fever pitch. It's the zenith of emotional tension, as it were. We've talked a lot about madness in this season so far, and so, we return to that topic here. Cioran's theory of madness, if it could even be called that, would probably be appealing to Foucault, because this would mean that madness is the pitch of one's heightened emotion, sort of raised to an explosive point, to the level that one's lyricism, one's need to objectify that emotion, and objectify it in an irrational way, objectify it in an expression which defies logic, structure, or form, because that's never sufficient to contain a feeling, that overwhelms their consciousness, their intellect, and so on. The need to objectify the tension within destroys whatever orderliness existed in their personality. This passage concludes with some of my favorite lines throughout all his work, quote, "Compared to the refined culture of sclerotic forms and frames which mask everything, the lyrical mode is utterly barbarian in its expression. Its value resides precisely in its savage quality. It is only blood, sincerity, and fire." End quote. So the opposition here is between lyricism and the refined culture of sclerotic forms and frames. What does that refer to? I mean, in a word, philosophy, or if that is too broad, the way of thinking through systems and through categories and through clear definitions. If I wanted to be a partisan in an old struggle, we might even say analytical thinking as opposed to continental. Now, obviously there's plenty of systematic thought in the continental tradition as well. I mean, it's hard to consider Aristotle or Kant as poets, but the lyrical mode, which reaches inward and objectifies an emotional state, how does Cioran describe it? It's barbarian, it's uncultured, opposed to the, we might say, academic way of thought. Similarly, opposed to clarity and restraint, and opposed to any way of thinking that prioritizes coherence and clarity above sincerity. So, the barbarian might not have a consciously articulated life philosophy, but he has sincerity. In a subsequent section, the absurdism and frankly the irrationalism of Cioran comes to the forefront, and this reinforces the distinction that Cioran is making between sincere, emotive, poetic writing and what we might call dialectic. This is the section called Passion for the Absurd. Quote, "There are no arguments. Can anyone who has reached the limit bother with arguments, causes, effects, moral consideration, and so forth? Of course not. For such a person, there are only the unmotivated motives for living. On the heights of despair, the passion for the absurd is the only thing that can still throw a demonic light on chaos. When all the current reasons, moral, aesthetic, religious, social, and so on, no longer guide one's life, how can one sustain life without succumbing to nothingness? Only by a connection with the absurd, by the love of absolute uselessness, loving something which does not have substance, but which simulates an illusion of life." End quote. So it's worth noting, Cioran's implicit goal in this passage is to tell us how to sustain life. How can we go on living in absentia of all the justifications by which life was previously justified? He even rules out aesthetic reasons, perhaps thinking of Nietzsche's early attempt at an aesthetic justification for life. Although, quite in keeping with the ideas of Nietzsche, he also rules out the moral and the religious and the social. But rather than, a self-legislative philosopher coming along to author new values, somehow impose this new reason for being upon the world, as Nietzsche would have it, Cioran is a pessimist. He's more of a pessimist than Nietzsche in this respect. Such a project doesn't really interest him, and there's a terrible consistency in his thought insofar as he fully embraces the impotence of philosophy. Perhaps one could argue that even Nietzsche is too idealist or too theoretical insofar as he sees our lives as being useful for something. Not utility in the classical sense, not utility in the sense that the utilitarians understand the term, but utility toward bringing forth the overman, a higher version of human life, right? Go under, sacrifice yourself for a great ideal, bring forward something greater than yourself. Well, Cioran says in a later passage in the book, entitled "Nothing is Important," quote, "Although life for me is torture, I cannot renounce it, because I do not believe in the absolute values in whose name I would sacrifice myself." End quote. In absurdly embracing life in all its uselessness, as Cioran calls us to do, he implicitly rejects such a thing as Nietzsche's project for mankind, or anyone else's project for mankind for that matter. He simply says, no, the reality is that all we have are the unmotivated motives for living. What does that mean? Quote, "If I were to be totally sincere, I would say that I do not know why I live and why I do not stop living. The answer probably lies in the irrational character of life that continues itself without reason." End quote. And I would agree. I think that's true. At the end of the day, we don't really have a quote-unquote reason to live. People will use that phrase of needing a reason, putting it into logical terms. But I think the reality is you either want to live or you don't. And Perhaps this point is a bit too Schopenhauerian, but there does seem to be some inherent pull towards self-preservation, at least in most living things. And that's precisely why Nietzsche has to romanticize and glorify the opposition to self-preservation in favor of self-overcoming, because he has to make self-overcoming look appealing enough to overcome our natural pull to preserve ourselves. And so there is something to the will to live or will to life idea. And while I don't agree with the Spinozistic or Schopenhauerian construal of this into a monistic essence, and I might even agree with Nietzsche that it's a sub-drive beneath the will to power. It's a form of the will to power. The will to power might be more fundamental than that. Nevertheless, there does seem to be something to it, just as a fact of organic life, if nothing else. And so much of philosophy in finding reasons to live obscures, once again, the organic origins of how well disposed to life we are or not. Going back to the passage, Passion for the Absurd, Cioran continues, quote, "For one who has lost everything, there is nothing left in life except the passion for the absurd. What else in life could still move a person? What seductions? Some say self-sacrifice for humanity, the public good, the cult of the beautiful, and so forth. I like only those people who have done away with all that, even for a short time. Only they have lived in an absolute manner. Only they have a right to speak about life." End quote. So earlier he spoke about those who have reached the limit. Here he speaks about those who have lost everything. We could take those descriptions metaphorically or literally. One who loses everything might be the victim of a physical calamity. Maybe it's just a person who has finally renounced all their anchoring worldviews or all their anchoring beliefs that justify life by making it, for example, useful for something. Or perhaps someone renounces all such worldviews precisely because they lose everything in the worldly sense, right? Either way, only these people who go beyond all such intellectual comforts about life can truly live. And Cioran's words almost betray a kind of admiration for such a person, an admiration for total nihilism. Only comforted by the absurdity of life, its meaninglessness, its uselessness, its self-perpetuating nature in absentia of reasons, the fact that we're a conscious ego along for a ride with a physiology which operates prior to consciousness and without its sanction, someone who simply embraces this in all of its ridiculousness and goes along with the ride. And can't even bring themselves to come up with a reason for suicide, right? I actually want to cross-reference these statements with a passage near the end of the work entitled "Nothing Matters." So we're just kind of skipping to the end. I'm going to kind of skip around the work as we go. I find all of his chapter titles to be absolutely hilarious. They always bring a smile to my lips, and I can't help but feel that this is intentional. So this is one of the most famous passages in the book from Nothing Matters. Quote, "Everything is possible, and yet nothing is. All is permitted, and yet again nothing. No matter which way we go, it is no better than any other. It is all the same whether you achieve something or not, have faith or not, just as it is all the same whether you cry or remain silent. There is an explanation for everything, and yet there is none. Everything is both real and unreal, normal and absurd, splendid and insipid. There is nothing worth more than anything else, nor any idea better than any other. Why grow sad from one's sadness and delight in one's joy? What does it matter whether our tears come from pleasure or pain? Love your unhappiness and hate your happiness. Mix everything up, scramble it all. Be a snowflake dancing in the air, a flower floating downstream. Have courage when you don't need to, and be a coward when you must be brave. Who knows? You may still be a winner. And if you lose, does it really matter? Is there anything to win in this world? All gain is a loss, and all loss is a gain. Why always expect a definite stance, clear ideas, meaningful words? I feel as if I should spout fire in response to all the questions which were ever put or not put to me." End quote. So of course, we could take this passage as brutally nihilistic, but when I reflect on the emotional state that the passage conjures, what it stirs in me, it's actually rather invigorating. I mean, Cioran doesn't say nothing matters, so you might as well kill yourself. He says quite the opposite. You might as well live in an experimental way, in an absurd way, in a way that completely ignores those sclerotic forms and frames of a rigid life philosophy. Your life philosophy probably has some truth to it, sure, but it is also, like all productions of the human mind, a falsehood, an idealization, a compensation, a creative reinterpretation of life. In the final analysis, it all turns to dust and nonsense anyway, once we really hold up what all of our philosophies are worth against the awareness of death and, the fact that we're granted a limited time in a chaotic universe. So, those who make careful plans and act from these inflexible moral principles or live for some end, we might say, they're just as likely to turn out the loser as the one who scrambles everything up, as Cioran says. Or maybe not just as likely. That's probably not permitted for me to say that. We'll say it's still possible in both cases, right? Given the randomness of life and the indifference of the universe. And the liberatory aspect of this approach to life is that it sort of gives us back precisely the thing that, say, for example, the Mujahideen has when he says, Inshallah, God willing, right? Or then in the film Kingdom of Heaven, the Knight Hospitalier, right? When he's told, you go towards certain death, and he answers, all death is certain. Ironically, those are voices of religious zealotry, but Cioran clues us into something. The power of these ideologies is in letting go of the consequences of one's actions and letting go of the tension of having to achieve something or having to become something, having to make one's life good for something, right? It's enough to simply trust in God, say it is all in God's hands. Cioran doesn't give us something to trust in, right? He makes the absolute lack of trust, the absolute lack of faith in anything, he makes that as good as anything else, right? It may well all turn out the same, is what he's saying, whether you have faith or not. Whatever happens, happens. I accept it. In Nietzschean language, we might say amor fati. But again, the sentiment at the end, which I will repeat, quote, why always expect a definite stance, clear ideas, meaningful words? I feel as if I should spout fire in response to all the questions which were ever put or not put to me, end quote. This is a thread running through the whole work that I would identify it as essentially anti-philosophical. It's not anti-intellectual per se, but it's against the dialectic. It's against the theoretical, against clarity, against definitions, against meaning. There are no arguments, just as there are no good questions, no good answers. Or rather, all are as good as any other. So what does it mean to say that one of them is good? None of it matters. And so it's liberatory nihilism, in a sense. You can release yourself, at least from the tension of worrying over it as if it matters. To return to that section again, entitled The Passion for the Absurd, there's an insightful part of that passage that emphasizes a point that was also advanced by Nietzsche, that quantities of suffering cannot be meaningfully compared. This is part of a broader point that Cioran makes about the incomparability of our different subjective experiences through life, and that oftentimes there's a kind of implicitly utilitarian argument that people will make to, we'll say, minimize someone's suffering, that you should think of your suffering relative to that of others, and not, therefore, feel so bad about it. In other words, starving children in Africa have it worse than you, so eat your broccoli, right? We've all heard the stereotypical refrain of so many parents, at least when I was growing up. But Cioran opposes this outlook. He says, quote, there is no objective standard because suffering cannot be measured according to the external stimulation or local irritation of the organism, but only as it is felt and reflected in consciousness. Alas, from this point of view, any hierarchy is out of the question. Each person remains with his own suffering, which he believes absolute and unlimited. How much would we diminish our own personal suffering if we were to compare it to all the world's sufferings until now, to the most horrifying agonies and the most complicated tortures, the most cruel deaths and the most painful betrayals, all the lepers, all those burned alive or starved to death? Nobody is comforted by the thought that we are all mortals, nor does anybody who suffers really find comfort in the past or present suffering of others. Because in this organically insufficient and fragmentary world, the individual is set to live fully, wishing to make of his own existence an absolute. Each subjective existence is absolute to itself. For this reason, each man lives as if he were the center of the universe or the center of history. then how could his suffering fail to be absolute? End quote. So there is sort of a unifying theme here, at least insofar as Cioran is attacking this, we might say, hierarchy of values in the same way that he attacked there being a hierarchy of ideas, of any idea being better than any other. Here he's saying no one's suffering is any worse than anyone else's. At the beginning, he raises a point that Nietzsche entertained as well. The quantitative comparison of pain or pleasure is an absurdity in itself. And in Nietzsche's view, that's because there's no true equality of quantities. All phenomena are essentially unequal, and so this idea of measuring suffering and its hierarchy is absurd. Nietzsche would have pointed out that the suffering of one sensitive aristocrat may account for more than the suffering of 100 hardened laborers, or however you put it. It's from the perspective of modern morality rather a grotesque point, not one that many hardened laborers will have any sympathy for, but nevertheless it raises the specter of an unequal experience of the same external stimulus, which to me seems rather obvious, that the really important point is that suffering is reflected in consciousness. It's not an objective phenomenon, and it contains this indelibly subjective element to it. But Cioran, in a way, goes even farther than Nietzsche, insofar as he keys into something which we might call the irreducible narcissism of perspective. Every perspective, ultimately, experiences itself as absolute, because no point of comparison exists, and we don't have access to this subjective content of other psyches. And so Cioran's point, therefore, cannot really be... He's not making the same kind of point as Nietzsche would, who Nietzsche advances an argument about essentially unequal quantities and so on. Cioran cuts straight to the heart of the matter, to say it again, quote, "Nobody is comforted by the thought that we are all mortals, nor does anybody who suffers really find comfort in the past or present suffering of others," end quote. Now, I think you could take some issue with that. I think that statement is worthy of criticism. But I think we've also, or most of us, have probably been in a situation like when in the moment of your actual suffering, right? It's one thing to sort of like have an intellectual distance on your suffering and think about suffering in maybe in a psychological sense and look at your total situation and compare it to people throughout history and realize, well, I do have my suffering, but my life is overall pretty good. I mean, I have access to clean drinking water and antiseptics and plenty of food on the shelves at the grocery store and so on and so forth, right? You can find that sort of relative comfort if you're just, say, depressed or something. But, in the moment, if you, just broke your leg, right, and your friend comes up to you and says, they used to break people in the wheel and break all of your limbs and kill you. At least you're not going through that. In that moment, it's not really a comfort to imagine the suffering of others, because if you're already at the sort of limits, the heights of suffering, in this case physical suffering, hearing about someone else who apparently suffered worse, in a way, it's your imagination isn't even able to accommodate it. Quite simply, that the relativistic approach to reframing our suffering, at least according to Cioran, it just doesn't really work. Our suffering is not relative. Our suffering is actually absolute. We might say this of any emotional reality, really. The emotional reality is tyrannical in that sense. It's an absolute monarch. This insight even allows Cioran some self-awareness, though, in regard to his own suffering in a kind of paradoxical way. So you'd think this kind of attitude might lead to, maybe self-conscious revelry in their own depths of their pain, right? As if the absolutism of one's experience were a license for wallowing in sorrow. But funnily enough, since every idea seems to be canceled out by some other opposite idea with an equal amount of truth, the awareness that the suffering would, of course, appear to him as absolute comes with the corresponding thought that this is only an appearance. And Cioran writes accordingly in the section entitled "Nothing is Important," quote, "How important can it be that I suffer and think? My presence in this world will disturb a few tranquil lives and will unsettle the unconscious and pleasant naivete of others. Although I feel that my tragedy is the greatest in history, greater than the fall of empires, I am nevertheless aware of my total insignificance. I am absolutely persuaded that I am nothing in this universe, and yet I feel that mine is the only real existence." End quote. And that's the comedy, the irony of Cioran's thoughts throughout this work. He makes an impassioned defense of the idea that our suffering, our entire subjective experience, is absolute and incomparable, and then in a subsequent aphorism, he makes the comparison of his own sadness to the fall of an empire with the implicit understanding that this in itself is kind of an absurdity. And that, in addition to the fact that he's completely convinced that his tragedy is the greatest in history, he's also convinced that it's not. Everything is possible, yet nothing is. Everything is permitted, yet again nothing. In another passage entitled, I Do Not Know, Cioran says, quote, I do not know what is right and what is wrong, what is allowed and what is not. I cannot judge and I cannot praise. There are no valid criteria and no consistent principles in the world. End quote. That's the methodless method of On the Heights of Despair. Every proposition is contradicted, almost studiously. Every idea which seems to provide solid ground turns out to be made of sand. And after all, to sort of recapitulate to my central thesis, these words are just reifications of Cioran's inner fire, as he would have put it. We should have never expected to find a firm foundation here. It's as though throughout the entire work he's at war with coherence, with clarity, with dialectic. He's totally disinterested in proving his case. And why? Well, in a section whose title was stolen by the writers of True Detective and put into the mouth of Detective Rust Cole, we live in a world in which nothing is solved. Obviously, in True Detective, the word solved has that additional sense of solving a case, but Cioran is really speaking to the futility of the philosophical and ever producing a solution to what is often called the problem of life. For whatever reason, perhaps the simple fact of the relative weakness of rational discursive thought when set to the task of discerning the mysteries of the universe, what has philosophy to show for these millennia of, its striving and struggles? Usually, the legacy of a philosopher is to leave behind new questions, new doubts. That's what begins the entire legacy of continental philosophy, beginning with Descartes, the methodology of doubt, as he says. But is anything ever solved? Again, isn't that, in a way, the payoff that we're all looking for out of philosophy? And many have claimed to give it to us, right? How many philosophers such as Hegel or Schopenhauer have claimed to have finally completed the system of German idealism or given us a final metaphysics, answered all of the questions of metaphysics? And yet someone else always comes along and problematizes their work, and obviously all of society hasn't become Hegelian or Schopenhauerian, so there was something about their work that failed to, in the same sense that a scientific paper would, right? We might say that if a scientific theory is able to be replicated and can produce results and lead to new technologies, eventually everyone will, there's no one out there who doubts the science behind planes flying. I don't know, aerodynamics, right? We know that planes can achieve enough lift and thrust in order to pull the massive weight of their body into the air, right, and fly with them. And that is proof, that's a demonstration that the science behind that works, right? And so there aren't really any plane skeptics out there, any flying skeptics, right? And that's something that people would have said was impossible for human beings to do thousands of years ago. Or, at least we had no examples of it. And so, but that never happens with philosophy. And I know this is in some way, a very straightforward point that many of you probably are already on board with, that philosophy is just fundamentally different from the sciences in that way. And that's true. But, Cioran is sort of raising that as one of the flaws of philosophical thought, that it never gets you there in the same way as the other disciplines. Cioran writes, quote, doubt is anxiety about problems and things, and has its origins in the unsolvable nature of all big questions. If such questions could be solved, the skeptic would revert to a more normal state. The question of the desperate man in this respect is utterly different. If all problems were solved, he would not be any less anxious, since his anxiety arises out of his subjective experience. Nobody in despair suffers from quote-unquote problems, but from his own inner torment and fire. It's a pity that nothing can be solved in this world. Yet there never was, and there never will be, anyone who would commit suicide for this reason. So much for the power that intellectual anxiety has over the total anxiety of our being. That is why I prefer the dramatic life, consumed by inner fires and tortured by destiny, to the intellectual, caught up in abstractions which do not engage the essence of our subjectivity. I despise the absence of risks, madness, and passion in abstract thinking. How fertile, live, passionate thinking is. Lyricism feeds it like blood pumped into the heart." End quote. So, Cioran says the real reason why philosophers from Anaximander all the way through to Schopenhauer have made it their business to elucidate the problems with life and have never succeeded, the reason why they never come to that final definitive answer that can be universally accepted is quite simple. Intellectual doubts are not the real source of our anxiety, and such intellectualizing about the problem of life is not the real source of our despair. No one has ever killed himself, nor ever will, because this world is a world in which nothing is solved. That's not the reason why. The reason for our despair is the brute reality of our existence, that we're thrown into this world of impermanence, speeding toward death, utterly alone the whole way through. As Lucretia says, life is one long struggle in the dark. That is a more sincere expression for somebody like Cioran than all of Schopenhauer's ramblings about negating the will. And I just want to read a bit more from the following section because it continues on this anti-philosophical theme. It hammers home Cioran's point here. Quote, "Those who write under the spell of inspiration, for whom thought is an expression of their organic nervous disposition, do not concern themselves with unity in systems. Such concerns, contradictions, and facile paradoxes indicate an impoverished and insipid personal life. Only great and dangerous contradictions betoken a rich spiritual life." End quote. And further down, continuing, quote, "All that is form, system, category, frame, or plan tends to make things absolute and springs from a lack of inner energy, from a sterile spiritual life. Life's great tensions verge on chaos and the madness of exaltation. Rich spiritual life must know chaos and the effervescent paroxysm of illness, because in them inspiration appears to be essential for creation, and contradictions become expressions of high inner temperatures. Nobody who does not love chaos is a creator, and whoever is contemptuous of illness must not speak of the spirit." End quote. So, once again, nothing great comes out of philosophy. We might imagine Cioran asking, just as they asked, what good can come out of Nazareth, right? What good can come out of philosophy? The apparent contradictions and paradoxes that might be raised over the course of studying Hegel's system, these come off to Cioran as insincere. They're insincere problems, right? It's more of a playground than a battlefield. The only contradictions that interest him are objectifications of great tension within the soul, the kind of tension that only occurs as the result of real life and the real problems of life, not intellectual problems. Again, the real problems of life, they don't involve the absence of reasons or the absence of a solution to metaphysics, right? Or that we haven't arrived at a universal moral code. The real problems of life are death, time, madness, loss, desires that are at war with one another. We might add to that list insomnia, right? Or if not that, affliction, perhaps chronic migraines, solitude, self-imposed or otherwise. Any number of undeniable, concrete, genuine sources of tension that can't be intellectualized away. Back when I was interested in Zen, I once heard a Zen master make a very interesting point about the art of koan study. A koan is a case or a dialogue. The literal meaning is case, or public case, but in the sense of the way a stenographer might record an interaction in a courtroom, right? So they're dialogues, usually between a Zen master and a student, or two masters. Sometimes a student and a student. Sometimes there's a layperson in there. Usually it's a master and a student. And what koans are known for is being absolutely defiant to rational analysis of any kind, right? You don't solve a koan like a riddle. There's no hidden meaning to the dialogues. People think there's some sort of esoteric meaning when they first get into Zen. There's not. Oftentimes, koans appear absurd. They involve interactions that are nonsensical. And one of the things that the Zen master said was that the koan faces us with a problem that we can't think our way out of. That the level at which you're supposed to interact with the koan is the level of immediate direct perception. By the time you begin to form thoughts and interpretations, you've already lost the plot. And so you can't think your way out of it. And what he said that really stuck with me, among the few things that I've taken away from Zen after abandoning my Zen studies, that death is kind of like that. You can't think your way out of it, right? So we might say, to be too philosophical or to take Cicero and import him into Zen, that the point of the koan is to learn to die, right? But I think Cioran would heartily agree with that sentiment. The uselessness of philosophy, the absurdity of philosophy, is that we can't think our way out of it. And that if philosophy is to learn to die, as Cicero said, again, we can never accomplish this. We can never learn to die. No intellectual solution gets you out of death. And in the end, it doesn't matter if you face death with stoic resolve or with raving anxiety, right? It's death either way. It doesn't matter what you think about it. So, I've spoken a great deal so far about how Cioran departs from Nietzsche in many ways, or rather more purely embraces the role of being just a pure lyrical writer, no regard for any kind of clear thought or point to his writing. This accordingly leads him to contradict Nietzsche on several points, but here I just want to note that last sentence could have easily come from the hand of Nietzsche. That phrase from Zarathustra's prologue, quote, "You must have chaos within yourself to give birth to a dancing star," end quote. And of course we can compare lines like that from Zarathustra to Cioran because that's a poetical line from a poetical work, so it invites so many different interpretations. But, again, we can take chaos to refer to the chaos of life, that internal struggle between competing drives, the absence of regularity or equality, that we might say that absence defines physical life, natural life. But regularity, equality, and order, those are all precisely what's required by an abstracted and explicitly articulated philosophical stance. And furthermore, the final remark about illness. Nietzsche wrote a great deal about illness as well, especially in Ecce Homo, but he wrote about it throughout his entire life, and we might remember his series of prefaces that he appended to his works from the middle period, which sort of, those prefaces over the course of all of them narrativize this period of his career and his life as a recovery from a long illness. Nietzsche not only experienced physiological illness, so illness in a literal sense, but also extrapolated his experiences with illness into analogous insights about ideas. Health and sickness are central to Nietzsche's philosophy precisely because he lived the chronic illness and often found himself seemingly on the edge of his own mortality. I want to include some of what Cioran writes on illness, which can be found in the passage on death. Quote, "The revelation of death's imminence in life occurs during illnesses and long depressive states. There are, of course, other ways, but they are accidental and individual and do not have the same potential for revelation as illness or depression. If illnesses have a philosophical mission in the world, then it can only be to prove how illusory is the feeling of life's eternity and how fragile its illusion of finality. In illness, death is always already in life. Genuine ailment links us to metaphysical realities which the healthy, average man cannot understand. Young people talk of death as external to life, but when an illness hits them with full power, all illusions and seductions of youth disappear. In this world, the only genuine agonies are those sprung from illness. All others bear the fatal mark of bookishness. Only those who suffer are truly capable of genuine content and infinite seriousness." End quote. Nietzsche came to similar conclusions, that his experience with illness gave him insights that the healthy person could never know, or the person who never had a brush with illness, right? In Ecce Homo, he actually attributes his philosophy to the interplay of health and sickness within himself, in that he sees his father as being sort of his sickly ancestor and his mother as a healthy ancestor, and thus he has both inside of him. So why would Nietzsche gain any insight from an illness? Why would an illness make him full of philosophical content? Well, if we follow Cioran, it's because illness is the imminence of death. Death now, in the experience of illness, is no longer something external. It's unmistakably something within, something of which the seeds are already inside of you, a process that you realize you've been undergoing every moment as a living being. I mean, as Seneca said, quote, "We do not suddenly fall upon death, but advance toward it by slight degrees. We die every day," end quote. Seneca's insight, it's only an insight in the first place, right? It's only a profound set of words in the first place because we spend a great deal of our lives living in what Cioran here calls the illusion of life's eternity. The interruption of this illusion is illness. And so in illness, we gain something very valuable, the potential for profundity, for content, true seriousness about life, right? A quote by Nietzsche is also apropos here, which this is an aphorism by Nietzsche, which is entitled simply Death. Quote, "The certain prospect of death could sweeten every life with a precious and fragrant drop of levity," end quote. So it's a strange thought, but illness gives us something, which means illness is actually productive. It is an encounter with the imminence of death, which in turn gives rise to the potential to take life seriously. What else could provide us with this? Well, Cioran also mentions depressive states, and he elaborates on this in the same section. Quote, "The structure of depressive states holds the key to their fundamental understanding. These states, in which separation from the world steadily and painfully increases, bring man closer to his inner reality and cause him to discover death in his own subjectivity. A growing interiority progresses toward the essential center of subjectivity, overcoming all the social forms which usually mask it. Once beyond this center, progressive interiority discovers the region where life mingles with death, where man has not yet detached himself from the primary sources of existence, where the demonic rhythm of life works with complete irrationality," end quote. Further down, he continues, quote, "One cannot conceive of death without nothingness, nor of life without a principle of negativity. The fear of death, which is nothing but the fear of nothingness into which death throws us, proves that death presupposes nothingness. The imminence of death in life is a sign of the final triumph of nothingness over life, thus showing that the presence of death has no other meaning than to open progressively the way toward nothingness," end quote. That's why every fear for Cioran is reducible to the fear of death, because perhaps to speak with Heideggerian language, we are beings who are uniquely aware of at least the question of being, of our existence as existence, plural, right? As that which exists in time and in a definite place. Beings that have a notion of our somethingness. For us, the ultimate fear is nothingness, for which we can possess no referent, because somethingness seems to define everything we know. But the imminence of death and the fact that death dwells within all life must lead to that inescapable conclusion of the imminence of nothingness. And that's the profundity that we discover in the throes of illness, which shatter the illusion of death's externality and its distance, right? Or in the throes of a depressive state, which he says drive us inevitably inward. And that's what happens with depression. It's really a mischaracterization to classify it as a form of sadness, really, because in depression, the things of the world become less and less appealing overall. It's not so much that sadness overwhelms, but that happiness disappears, we might say. Where joy existed previously, it just turns to ashes. Many depressives feel a sense of numbness or detachment from their lives or from other people, from the rest of the world. And when you're driven into that total interiority, total absorption in your own subjectivity, the absolute nature of your own suffering, right? And the imminence of your own death and the fact that we're intimately bound up with nothingness, all of this becomes irrefutable and inescapable and sort of in this ruminating state. And not just from an intellectual perspective, but in the sense of really feeling that in that tyrannical, absolute subjective experience within our own emotional world. But again, this is, dare I say it, a positive thing, from a certain perspective anyway. The fact that the imminence of nothingness provides you with this profundity, with what Cioran calls a truly spiritual life. This inner tension, knowing of your existence as a being towards death, again to use Heideggerian formulation, that's a source of that chaos, of that inner fire that produces the truly lyrical. And so we could again see the intense pessimism of Cioran, his apparent nihilism, as a prelude to unfettered creativity, unfettered living no longer bound by thinking that one has to justify one's life or make it useful for some end. And yet everything Cioran affirms, he has to turn around in another place and deny it. So we've emphasized the potentially at least productive element of such a proudly irrational and absurd way of life as Cioran seems to outline it here. And yet he has moments when he confesses that this same ideology makes him world-weary, makes him unproductive. He writes, quote, "I'm weary of being a man. If I could, I would renounce my condition on the spot. But what would I become then, an animal? I cannot retrace my steps. Besides, I might become an animal who knows the history of philosophy. As to becoming Superman, that seems to me utter and ridiculous folly. Could there be a solution, approximate of course, in a sort of superconsciousness? Couldn't one live beyond, not just on this side toward animality, all complex forms of consciousness, anxiety, agony, in a sphere of life where access to eternity would no longer be pure myth? As far as I am concerned, I resign from humanity. I no longer want to be, nor can still be, a man. What should I do? Work for a social and political system? Make a girl miserable? Hunt for weaknesses in philosophical systems? Fight for moral and aesthetical ideals? It's all too little. I renounce my humanity, even though I may find myself alone." End quote. There's little to say about this passage except to note the explicit rejection of Nietzscheanism once again, of becoming Superman, the avowed desire to attain to some kind of superconsciousness beyond the phenomenal world, beyond the physical, become a being with access to eternity. And that's a very common desire among especially modern people who hyper-identify ourselves with our consciousness. But it's a direct contradiction to Cioran's other remarks about the organic origins of our inner states, thoughts springing from the impulses, of the only worthwhile philosophy is springing from flesh and blood. I mean, in another passage he writes, quote, "I can never understand why so many have called the body an illusion, just as I will never understand how they could imagine spirituality outside the drama of life, with all its contradictions and shortcomings. It must be that they were never aware of the flesh, the nerves, each organ in itself." End quote. So again, there's no consistency here, and I wouldn't really want there to be. It would be insincere of us to deny. Many sensitive minds have moments of total embrace of the world, total embrace of the physical and the hard reality, and moments of wishing to fly from that reality, to escape the physical and to, as he puts it here, resign from being a person. These are genuine feelings that people oscillate between. And in fact, in a later section, Cioran goes farther with another one of my favorite quotes from the whole book, where he doesn't just say he wants to resign from being a man. He says, quote, "I am displeased with everything. If they made me God, I would immediately resign. And if the world were just me, I would sunder myself apart, burst into tiny pieces, and disappear." End quote. So Cioran's saying, if I were to be made into God, I would become mainlander's God, break myself into a million pieces. And so Cioran explicitly says, basically, nothing in life seems worth doing. And that's the converse of Cioran's brand of, what we might call positive nihilism earlier. Nothing matters, so you can do anything, right? So it's like you could look at it two ways. Nothing is worth doing, nothing matters, so you can do anything, or nothing matters, so why do anything? No action, no course of life is better than any other. As Cioran says in another section, quote, "Why should I live in history or worry about the social and cultural problems of the age? I'm weary of culture and history." End quote. And so, you can see the pessimism here as a very disempowering life philosophy, and of course it could be, but perhaps someone like Nietzsche would remind us that whether someone takes Cioran and becomes world-weary, or whether they take Cioran's nihilism and decide to live an unfettered life, doesn't that really have to do with them, right? Isn't that a reflection of their instincts, whether they are strong or weak, or whether they are life-affirming or world-weary? To return to a question raised at the beginning of this episode, how could someone's philosophy, their ideas about reality, have any effect on you at all unless there was already something in you that resonated with those ideas? Isn't philosophy always a post hoc rationalization for the irrational? There's one final aspect of this book I want to cover before the end of the episode. And I just want to say there's so much more to this book that we're not covering. And again, it's impossible to talk about it in any systematic way. So I had just to pick a few threads out of it to talk about. But I wanted to talk about Cioran's attitude towards the religions of renunciation, and those would be primarily Christianity and Buddhism. Now, in so many words, he rejects them, but it might not be immediately clear why he would do this. I mean, if the world is such a painful and disappointing place, if he yearns at times for a disembodied existence with access to eternity, why would Cioran not pursue asceticism? Why not renounce worldly desires, as Schopenhauer does, for example, or at least idealizes the state of renouncing worldly desires? Why not live one's life in pursuit of ending suffering? Well, first, Cioran, and another similarity to Nietzsche, really has disdain for pity and compassion, and that springs as much from the absolutism of one's own inner state as it does from the fact that Cioran thinks that compassion is simply not worth much in the final analysis. Quote, "I do not feel mediocre enough to feel compassion for anyone. Compassion is a sign of superficiality. Broken destinies and unrelenting misery either make you scream or turn you into a stone. Pity is not only inefficient, it is also insulting. And besides, how can you pity another when you yourself suffer ignominiously? Compassion is as common as it is because it does not bind you to anything. Nobody in this world has yet died from another's suffering, and the one who said that he died for us did not die. He was killed." End quote. So at the end there, we have the direct repudiation of the notion of Jesus as sacrifice. But more to the point, Cioran does not see the renunciation of the world as practiced by the aesthetic. He doesn't see that as a realistic or laudable goal, and sort of following Nietzsche's method once again, he looks to the motivation behind aestheticism and suggests it's not as selfless as the aesthetics want us to believe. The following section, entitled Renunciation, begins by addressing itself directly to the story of Siddhartha Gautama, the sights he saw, witnessing impermanence and suffering upon leaving his palace for the first time. Quote, "So you witnessed old age, pain, and death, and told yourself that pleasure is an illusion and that the pleasure seekers do not understand the inconstancy of things. Then you shunned the world, persuaded that nothing will endure. I will not return, you proclaimed, before I have escaped birth, old age, and death. There is much pride and suffering in every renunciation. Instead of retreating discreetly without a big show of revolt and hatred, you denounce, emphatically and haughtily, others' ignorance and illusions. You condemn their pleasures. The ascetics who renounced life and fled into the desert were convinced that they had overcome all human weaknesses. The belief that they had access to a subjective eternity gave them the illusion of total liberation. Nonetheless, their condemnation of pleasure and their contempt for humanity betray their inability to actually free themselves. Were I to withdraw into the most fearsome desert, renounce everything, and live in absolute solitude, still I would never dream of despising men and their pleasure. Since I cannot really enter into eternity through renunciation and solitude, since I shall die like the rest, why despise them? Why call my way the only true one? All the great prophets lack discretion and human understanding. I witness pain, old age, death, and I know that they cannot be overcome. But why should I spoil another's enjoyment with my knowledge? Suffering and the consciousness of its inescapability lead to renunciation, and yet nothing would induce me, not even if I were to become a leper, to condemn another's joy. There is much envy in every act of condemnation. Buddhism and Christianity are the revenge and the spite of those who suffer." End quote. So I wanted to end on this note, not simply for the reason of pointing out Nietzsche's account of the aesthetic ideal and how it's so similar to Cioran's. But again, so often those who problematize life want to leave us with a kind of solution to the problem and answer to life's questions. And there's a real sense in which the aesthetic ideal, whether it's found in Christianity or Buddhism, always returns to the same fundamental notion of renouncing the world, renouncing pleasure, renouncing desire. Turn all your attention to metaphysical and moral concerns, solitary prayer and charity and vows of poverty and so on. And not only does Cioran see this as a false story, that there's still pride and selfishness even in this, but above all he recognizes it's not an answer to anything. Quote, "I witness pain, old age, and death, and I know it cannot be overcome." End quote. So the promise of the Buddha, that one can transcend suffering, just as empty of a promise as that of Christian salvation, or Nietzsche's promise of sacrificing oneself to bring forth something superhuman. From Cioran's point of view, all are attempts to give life a meaning, an intelligible content, a use, some telos, which may serve as a comfort, as an anchor. But for Cioran, life is not really comprehended, it's not really experienced until one collides with life in absentia of all such comforts, all such reasons, all such meanings. So unlike the philosophy of Schopenhauer, Cioran is a pessimist who says there is no escape, there is no negation, there is no nirvana. As he says here, I know I'll die like all the rest of them. I don't have anything figured out that's going to make this improve the lot of mankind. There's only the absurd and the terrifying paroxysm of life's anxieties. The only response to this is a concept that Cioran invokes again and again throughout the text, which I have not yet mentioned, but which bears mentioning at the very end, heroism. This is, in a word, we would just call it irrational bravery in the face of imminent nothingness. Strictly speaking, it's not even bravery, really. It's perhaps better described as the willingness to fall to pieces, the willingness to surrender to fear without any promise that there's anything beyond that fear or anything that will make it all better in the end. In a passage entitled Disintegration, Cioran elaborates on what his heroism means, and we'll end on this passage, quote, "There are only two fundamental attitudes, the naive and the heroic. All the others partake of them. One must choose between these two in order to avoid idiocy. But for the man who has come to make such a choice, innocence is no longer an option, so there remains only heroism. The latter is both a privilege and a curse for those severed from life, incapable of fulfillment and happiness. To be a hero, in the most universal sense of the word, means to aspire to absolute triumph. But such triumphs come only through death. Heroism means transcending life. It is a fatal leap into nothingness, even though the hero may not be aware that his energy springs from a life deprived of its normal supports. All that is innocence, and does not lead to it, belongs to nothingness." End quote. That's all for this week, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this tour through the madness, fire, and blood of that great insomniac, Cioran. If the subject matter this week has left you unsettled, perhaps fearful, perhaps trembling a bit, well, I'm not going to let up. Next week, we're finally going to cover a philosopher that, to be quite honest, I never had much interest in before this podcast, but I'd been asked to cover his work so many times that I decided to dive into it. So over the past year, I've familiarized myself with him, and we're finally going to visit the work of Soren Kierkegaard, and we'll talk a little bit about his life and some of his general ideas, as well as his opus, Fear and Trembling. So I hope you'll join me then. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.